You think you are an engineer? Dr. Marcus Hayes threw the plastic clipboard. It hit the old man square in the chest. You change light bulbs. You mop floors. You do not tell me about hydraulic pressure. Valve number 4 is vibrating, sir, Arthur said. His voice was low, steady. Hayes stepped forward. He kicked Arthur's heavy metal toolbox. Solid steel wrenches clattered across the wet tiles. Dirty brown water splashed up, soaking the bottom of Arthur's faded work pants. "Get back to the basement," Hayes spat, "and stay out of my way." He didn't know it yet, but that arrogant young director had just made the biggest mistake of his entire career. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, his $2 billion dam was going to collapse. And the old man he just humiliated was the only person on Earth who knew how to save it. I promise you this. By the end of this story, you are going to watch this arrogant man lose absolutely everything. But before we get to that moment, before the sirens scream and the concrete fractures, let me take you back. We need to go back 12 hours. Titan Creek Dam, a massive, curved wall of solid reinforced concrete sitting at the edge of the Blackwood Valley. It was a monument to human arrogance, a blockade holding back 3 million gallons of dark, freezing river water. If you stand at the bottom of the spillway and look up, the dam blocks out the sky. It makes you feel incredibly small. It makes you feel fragile, millions of tons of pressure pressing against the wall every single second of every single day. But nobody felt smaller than the man walking down the service corridor of Level 4. 300 feet below the surface, where the sunlight never reaches, where the air always smells like wet ozone, heavy machine grease, and damp earth. Arthur Vance walked slowly, 62 years old. He moved like a man carrying an invisible weight. Every step was a calculated effort. His left knee popped and ground together with every movement, a cruel gift from 40 years of climbing vertical steel ladders and standing on freezing concrete. Arthritis had settled deep into his joints, making his knuckles thick and swollen, but he never complained. He couldn't afford to complain. He wore a pair of hospital orange maintenance coveralls. The fabric was faded to a pale peach from hundreds of washes. It was thin, much too thin for the biting cold of the underground tunnels. The cold seeped right through the cloth, settling directly into his spine. His boots were scuffed gray leather. The left sole was peeling away, held together by 3 thick layers of silver duct tape. Pinned to his chest pocket was a cheap plastic name tag. It hung from a frayed piece of string. It didn't have his last name. It didn't have a fancy title or a degree. It just said one word: Artie. Maintenance. $12.50 an hour. That was his entire worth to the Titan Creek Energy Corporation. Barely enough to pay for his heating bill and his blood pressure medication. Arthur pushed a heavy yellow mop bucket down the long, empty hall. The plastic wheels squeaked a rhythmic, lonely sound against the damp concrete. For 8 hours a day, Arthur was a ghost. The invisible old man who mopped up the oil spills, replaced the burned-out fluorescent bulbs, and scraped the rust off the secondary catwalks. He was the kind of person you could walk past 1,000 times and never actually see. A group of junior technicians rushed past him. They wore pristine white hard hats and clean safety vests. They carried expensive digital tablets. They were laughing about something. They didn't look at Arthur. They didn't nod. They simply parted around his mop bucket, the way a river steps around a rock. Invisible. That was the rule of this modern world. People do not look at you if they think you have nothing to offer. They measure your worth by the degree on your wall and the price of your shoes. Arthur didn't mind the silence. He didn't ask for their respect. He just kept his head down, kept his hands moving, kept the floors clean. Down here in the dark, the machines told the truth. A water pump either worked or it didn't. A pressure pipe either leaked or it held. There were no politics in the basement. There was only physics. He stopped at the end of the corridor. He leaned heavily against the mop handle to take the weight off his burning knee. He reached into the deep right pocket of his coveralls. He pulled out a wrench. It wasn't a standard maintenance tool. It was a massive, heavy, industrial steel wrench, the kind used to turn high-pressure municipal valves. It weighed almost 5 pounds. But you couldn't see the metal on the handle. The entire lower half of it was wrapped tightly in black electrical tape, layer upon layer. The tape was old, peeling at the edges, and worn completely smooth from years of friction against his calloused hands. It looked like a piece of junk, something a plumber might throw away. Arthur held it like a sacred object. He touched it the way a man touches a locket, keeping the memory of a lost loved one alive. He ran his rough thumb over the black tape. Slow, deliberate, he carried it everywhere, every single shift, for 20 years. He looked up at the massive steel casing of valve number 4, the main overflow pipe. It was completely silent now, a sleeping giant of cast iron and high-pressure bolts. Arthur remembered the day those bolts were tightened. He remembered the man who taught him how to listen to them. His old mentor, a master architect who had taught him everything about structural integrity, back when Arthur was just a young man with strong knees and big dreams. A man long dead, but whose voice still echoed in Arthur's mind every time he walked these lower halls. Water does not care about your mathematics, Artie. The old man's voice was a rough whisper in his memory. It does not read computer screens. It does not respect your digital models. It does not negotiate. Arthur closed his eyes. He tightened his grip on the heavy wrench. His knuckles went pale. Water only respects one thing. It reads the strength of steel. If the steel is weak, the math does not matter. Treat the steel with respect, or the water takes everything. Arthur opened his eyes. He pulled his hand away from the cold pipe. He believed those words. He lived by them. While the rest of the world was looking up at glowing digital monitors, Arthur was always looking down at the foundation. He slipped the heavy, taped wrench back into his deep pocket. He grabbed his mop. The wooden handle was worn perfectly smooth from his palms. He had 3 more corridors to scrub before his mandatory 30-minute lunch break. A cold ham sandwich sitting in a brown paper bag in the locker room. It was a quiet morning, routine, mundane. But 300 feet above him, in the pristine, climate-controlled glass box of the central control room, the meteorology monitors were starting to flash yellow. The air pressure in the valley was dropping fast. The skies off the coast were turning a bruised, violent purple. A Category 5 hurricane was exactly 12 hours away. And the young, arrogant engineers upstairs were looking at the wrong screens. 300 feet above the dark, damp basement, the world was entirely different. The central control room of Titan Creek Dam looked like the bridge of a spaceship. Pristine white floor tiles that shined like glass. Climate-controlled air that smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. Massive, curved monitors lined the curved front wall, glowing with thousands of data streams. And standing at the center of it all was Dr. Marcus Hayes, 30 years old, Regional Director of Operations. Hayes did not wear coveralls. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. A silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His black leather shoes were polished to a mirror shine. They had never touched mud, grease, or standing water. On his left wrist ticked an $18,000 gold watch. A heavy, beautiful piece of machinery that told the time, but more importantly, told everyone in the room exactly who was in charge. Hayes was a man of the digital age. He graduated at the top of his class at MIT. He did not believe in human intuition. He believed in algorithms. He believed in the machine. Specifically, he believed in the $50 million predictive artificial intelligence system that he had personally pushed the federal board to install. The system was designed to monitor every microfracture, every pressure drop, and every vibration across the 3-mile span of the dam. "The screen is blue," Hayes liked to say, "and blue means perfection." A young junior engineer named Sarah sat at Terminal 4. She hesitated, her finger hovering over her keyboard. She looked at a small analog gauge on her secondary desk, then looked at the massive digital screen above. "Dr. Hayes," Sarah asked. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. Hayes sighed. He slowly turned around. He did not like being interrupted. He walked over to her desk, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the pristine tiles. He stood uncomfortably close, looking down at her. "What is it, Sarah?" His tone was smooth, but laced with absolute contempt. "Sir, the manual pressure sensors on the lower levels are showing a 3% variance from the AI readout. The water level in the reservoir is rising faster than the digital models predicted. I think we should send a visual inspection team down to valve 4. Hayes stared at her. His jaw tightened just a fraction. He leaned down, placing both of his perfectly manicured hands on her desk. "Sarah," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the rest of the room could hear. "Do you know how many data points this system processes in a single second? 4 million. Do you really believe your little analog gauge is smarter than a $50 million matrix?" Sarah swallowed hard. She looked down at her lap. "No, sir. But standard protocol says." "I write the protocol," Hayes interrupted. He stood up straight, adjusting his silk tie. "Last month, I fired 4 senior engineers because they refused to adapt to the new system. They thought their guts were smarter than my algorithms. They do not work here anymore. Do you understand what I am telling you, Sarah?" She didn't look up. "Yes, Dr. Hayes." "Good. The screen is blue. Watch the screen." He turned and walked back to the center of the room. He didn't care about her anxiety. He only cared about his flawless record. But outside the reinforced glass windows, perfection was falling apart. At exactly 8 o'clock at night, the hurricane made landfall. Category 5. It did not arrive slowly. It slammed into the Blackwood Valley like a freight train. Wind speeds instantly surpassed 160 miles per hour. The rain did not fall from the sky. It flew sideways, violent and blinding, hitting the concrete face of the dam like bullets. The reservoir behind the dam turned into a boiling cauldron of black water. Massive waves, 50 feet high, crashed against the retaining walls. The sheer kinetic force of millions of tons of water hammering the structure was unimaginable. Inside the glass box of the control room, the storm was just a muffled hum. The glass was soundproof. The lights were steady. Hayes sipped a cup of hot espresso. He watched his massive digital screens. They remained a comforting, steady blue. But 300 feet below, in the belly of the beast, there was no soundproof glass. Arthur Vance was mopping the corridor near the main overflow pipes. The storm outside was making the entire concrete tunnel vibrate. The water in his yellow mop bucket rippled constantly. Arthur's arthritic knee throbbed with a vicious, burning pain. His joints always knew when the barometric pressure dropped, but tonight the pain was blinding. He had to lean heavily on his wooden mop handle just to stay upright. The air down here was different now. The normal, steady hum of the massive generators had changed its pitch. It was a subtle shift, the kind of thing a computer might filter out as background noise. The kind of thing a young engineer from MIT would never notice. But Arthur noticed. He stopped mopping. He stood perfectly still in the dim, flickering fluorescent light. He tilted his head, listening. Beyond the roar of the rushing water, there was a new sound. Ping. A sharp metallic pop, like a guitar string snapping in a dark room. Arthur's chest tightened. He slowly turned his head toward the massive cast iron casing of valve number 4, the primary release gate. Grow on. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the sound of metal crying. It was the agonizing shriek of cast iron being stretched past its tensile limit. The bolts holding the massive plate together were warping under an immense, impossible pressure. Arthur dropped his mop. The wooden handle clattered against the concrete floor. He ignored the burning pain in his knee and rushed toward the enormous pipe. He didn't look at a digital readout. He didn't check a tablet. He took off his thick work glove and placed his bare, calloused hand flat against the heavy iron casing. Arthur gasped. He pulled his hand back. The metal wasn't cold from the river water. It was burning hot. Friction. The internal gears of the valve were twisting, grinding against each other as the concrete around them began to subtly shift under the weight of the storm. The valve was failing. The metal was expanding. Arthur looked up at the ceiling. There were no red flashing lights. The automated siren was dead silent. The $50 million machine was missing it. Arthur reached deep into the pocket of his faded orange coveralls. His fingers wrapped around the thick black electrical tape of his heavy steel wrench. The wrench he had carried for 20 years. He knew the company rules. Maintenance workers were strictly forbidden from entering the central control room without an armed security escort. It was an instant termination offense. If he walked through those doors, he would lose his $12 an hour job. He would lose his tiny pension. But if he didn't, thousands of people in the valley below would lose their lives. Arthur Vance tightened his grip on the wrench. He turned away from the failing pipe and limped toward the emergency stairwell. He was going to march into that pristine glass box, and he was going to tell the smartest, most arrogant man in the building that his beautiful blue screens were lying. It was a long walk up 300 feet of stairs, and at the top of those stairs, a violent collision of two completely different worlds was waiting. 300 vertical feet. 15 flights of heavy industrial grating. For a young man, climbing the emergency stairwell was a quick jog. For a 62-year-old man with severe arthritis and a degenerating left knee, it was an agonizing, punishing battle. Every single step sent a sharp, electric spike of pain shooting up Arthur's leg. His breathing grew heavy and ragged. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, mixing with the freezing condensation that clung to his face. But he did not stop. He couldn't. He kept his right hand deep in his pocket, his rough, calloused fingers wrapped tightly around the worn black tape of his heavy steel wrench. The terrifying sound of the groaning metal from valve 4 was still echoing in his bones. It was a sound he had not heard in 30 years. A sound that meant death. He reached the top landing, level 1, the executive deck. Before him stood the heavy, reinforced, soundproof glass doors of the central control room. Above the handle, a bright red sign glowed with an absolute warning. Restricted area, authorized personnel only. Arthur pushed his weight against the heavy glass. The contrast was violently sudden. He stepped out of the dark, damp, roaring concrete stairwell and into a silent, perfectly climate-controlled sanctuary. The air in the control room smelled like filtered oxygen, expensive cologne, and lemon floor wax. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the server racks and the quiet, frantic clicking of computer keyboards. 20 junior engineers sat at their sleek, minimalist workstations. They were bathed in the soft, flawless blue glow of the massive digital monitors covering the front wall. It was a room designed to make nature look small, designed to make the hurricane outside seem like a minor inconvenience. Arthur took a step forward. His wet, scuffed gray leather boots hit the pristine, perfectly polished white tiles. Dirty brown water, mixed with thick basement grease and mud, oozed from the cracked sole of his left boot. It left a dark, ugly, toxic-looking stain on the flawless white floor. He took another step, another dark smear. One by one, the clicking of the keyboards stopped. Heads turned. 20 highly educated engineers stopped what they were doing and stared at the old man in the faded, soaking wet orange coveralls. He looked like a creature that had crawled out of a swamp and into a sterile laboratory. At the front of the room, Dr. Marcus Hayes was standing with his back to the door, holding a delicate porcelain cup of espresso, giving quiet instructions to a senior supervisor. He heard the silence in the room. He slowly turned around. Hayes looked at Arthur. Then his eyes dropped slowly to the floor. He saw the puddle of dirty, oily water spreading across his perfect white tiles. His jaw locked. The muscles in his neck tightened visibly against his silk tie. Hayes handed his espresso to the supervisor without even looking at him. He walked across the room. He moved slowly, deliberately. The heavy silence in the control room was absolute. You could hear the faint ticking of the $18,000 gold watch on his wrist. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from Arthur, close enough for Arthur to smell the sharp scent of his designer cologne, close enough for Hayes to smell the damp earth and sweat on Arthur. "What in God's name?" Hayes whispered, his voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Are you doing in my control room?" Arthur stood perfectly still. He did not shrink back. He did not lower his eyes. He ignored the burning pain in his knee. "Valve number 4 is expanding, sir," Arthur said. His voice was calm, short, precise. Hayes let out a breath that sounded like a hiss. He looked around the room at his staff. He wanted an audience for this. He wanted them to watch him put this peasant back in his place. "Valve number 4, Hayes repeated, raising his voice so it bounced off the soundproof glass walls. A piece of machinery monitored by a $50 million artificial intelligence matrix. A matrix that is currently reading a perfect, flawless blue across all visual spectrums. And you, a man wearing a plastic name tag on a dirty piece of string, are telling me that it is expanding." "The internal bolts are groaning," Arthur said, refusing to take the bait. "The iron casing is hot to the touch. The metal is warping under the pressure." Hayes let out a short, dry laugh. It was a cruel, empty sound. "The metal is warping," Hayes mocked. He took a step closer, towering over the old man. "Let me explain something to you, Artie. The human ear is a flawed, primitive instrument. It hears echoes. It hears ghosts. You are an uneducated relic walking around in the dark. You change light bulbs. You mop up the spills that my engineers leave behind. You do not diagnose high-pressure hydraulic systems. You do not think." Sarah, the junior engineer sitting at Terminal 4, swallowed hard. She looked at her analog gauge. The physical needle was trembling, creeping higher into the yellow zone. She looked at Arthur, her hands shaking in her lap. She wanted to speak. She opened her mouth. But Hayes didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on Arthur, full of absolute contempt. "Your screens are lying to you, Dr. Hayes," Arthur said, his voice completely flat. "If you do not manually bleed the pressure on the lower deck, that valve will fracture in less than an hour." The room went completely dead. Nobody told the regional director that his screens were lying. Nobody. Hayes's face lost its polite, arrogant smile. The skin around his eyes went tight. His knuckles turned completely white. "You think you know better than the machine." Hayes took one final step forward, invading Arthur's physical space. "You think you belong in this room with real minds?" Hayes reached out. His manicured hand grabbed the cheap plastic name tag pinned to Arthur's chest. He didn't just unclip it. He closed his fist around the plastic and yanked it downward with a violent, sudden force. The frayed string broke against the back of Arthur's neck, leaving a red welt. The metal safety pin tore a jagged hole right through the faded orange fabric of his coveralls. Hayes held the broken tag up in the air for a second, then threw it onto the floor. It landed right in the puddle of dirty basement water. "Your access is permanently revoked," Hayes said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. "You are terminated. Effective immediately. You do not work for Titan Creek Energy. You will not receive a severance. You will not receive a reference. You are nothing." Arthur looked down at his broken name tag, floating in the dirty water. 30 years of his life, discarded on the floor like garbage. He looked back up at Hayes. His expression did not change. His hand remained deep in his pocket, touching the taped steel wrench. "The water does not care who I am, sir," Arthur whispered, "and it does not care who you are." Hayes sneered. He reached for his radio to call security. He was about to order the armed guards to throw the old man out into the freezing hurricane. But before his finger could press the transmit button, the floor beneath their feet gave a sudden, violent shudder. It wasn't a small vibration. It was a deep structural heave. A ceramic coffee mug on Sarah's desk tipped over, shattering loudly on the pristine white tiles. Hayes froze. He slowly turned his head away from Arthur, looking up at the massive digital wall of monitors. The screens were still a perfect, beautiful blue. But the concrete beneath his expensive leather shoes was trembling. The ceramic shards of Sarah's broken coffee mug lay scattered across the pristine white tiles. Dark liquid seeped into the grout, mixing with the muddy water dripping from Arthur's boots. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. 20 highly educated junior engineers held their breath. The physical tremor had traveled up through 300 feet of solid concrete and steel. It was real. It was undeniable. It was the sound of a structure screaming in pain. But Dr. Marcus Hayes did not look down at the trembling floor beneath his expensive leather shoes. He stared up at his $50 million artificial intelligence matrix. The massive digital screens flickered. For exactly 2 seconds, a jagged, violent, red warning line spiked across the hydraulic pressure graph. Then, the machine did exactly what it was programmed to do. It assumed the anomaly was a sensor error. It applied a smoothing algorithm. The jagged red line vanished. The screens returned to a beautiful, flawless, comforting blue. "You see," Hayes pointed a manicured finger at the monitors. His voice was thick with desperate, arrogant relief. It was a phantom echo, a microseismic shift. The matrix filtered it out. The system is perfect. He looked back at Arthur. His silk tie was slightly crooked from his momentary panic. He straightened it with a sharp tug. "I told you, old man," Hayes sneered. "Your primitive ears are playing tricks on you. Now get out of my control room before I have you arrested for trespassing." Arthur did not turn toward the door. He did not look at the glowing screens. "The water does not care about your blue screens," Arthur repeated. His voice wasn't angry. It was heavy with the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. "If valve 4 fractures, the entire lower retaining wall will implode. You have less than 30 minutes to manually open the secondary spillways." Arthur stepped around the director. He didn't ask for permission. He walked right past the terrified junior engineers, heading straight for the far wall. Mounted behind a clear, reinforced plastic case was the manual emergency lockdown override, a massive red button that would instantly bypass the artificial intelligence, sound the evacuation sirens, and trigger a physical reset of the lower decks. "What are you doing?" Hayes yelled, his voice cracking. Arthur reached the wall. He raised his calloused, dirty hand. He curled it into a fist and smashed it against the plastic cover. The plastic cracked, but it didn't break. He pulled his fist back for a second strike. "Do not touch that," Hayes lunged forward. He didn't just grab Arthur's arm. Hayes shoved the old man with both of his hands, hitting him squarely in the chest with all of his weight. It was a violent, cowardly move. Arthur was 62 years old, exhausted, balancing on a degenerating left knee. The impact lifted Arthur completely off his feet. He flew backward. His bad knee buckled the exact moment it hit the hard tile floor. A sickening pop echoed in the quiet room. Arthur hit the ground hard. His right shoulder slammed against the heavy metal base of a server rack. The air was knocked completely out of his lungs. A sharp, blinding white pain shot up his leg and exploded in his chest. As he fell, his right hand slipped from his deep pocket. The heavy, industrial steel wrench flew across the pristine floor. It slid 10 feet, spinning violently, before slamming into the polished metal leg of Hayes's desk. Hayes stood over Arthur, his chest heaving. The perfectly composed, highly educated director was gone. In his place was a terrified, arrogant bully lashing out at the only person brave enough to tell him he was wrong. Hayes looked down at the wrench. It was an ugly, brutal-looking piece of metal. The entire lower half of the handle was wrapped tightly in thick, dirty black electrical tape. The tape hid the truth. It hid the engraving. It hid the history of the man lying bleeding on the floor. To Hayes, it just looked like a piece of garbage. "You bring a weapon into my control room?" Hayes sneered. He kicked the wrench further under his desk, completely out of Arthur's reach. "You attempt to smash federal property?" Arthur tried to push himself up. His left knee screamed in pure agony. He bit his lip so hard he tasted copper, refusing to give Hayes the satisfaction of hearing him groan. Hayes reached down to his belt and pulled his security radio. "Security team to the central control room. Code red. I have a violent trespasser." Arthur sat on the cold floor, leaning his back against the server rack. He looked around the room. 20 engineers, 20 brilliant minds. Sarah, sitting at Terminal 4, had tears rolling down her cheeks. Her hands were clamped over her mouth. The engineer next to her was staring intensely at his keyboard, pretending nothing was happening. Not a single one of them made eye contact with the old man on the floor. They had mortgages, they had student loans, they had careers, and Hayes had just proved that he would destroy anyone who questioned his authority. Silence is the loudest form of cowardice. The heavy glass doors burst open. 2 massive security guards rushed in, wearing dark tactical gear. Arthur recognized the guard on the left immediately. Ramirez, a big, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s. For the past 3 years, Ramirez had taken his 2 o'clock in the morning coffee breaks down in the basement boiler room with Arthur. They had shared thermoses of cheap black coffee. They had shared stories about their grandchildren. Now Ramirez stopped dead in his tracks. He saw Arthur on the floor. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "Artie?" Ramirez whispered, dropping his hand from his radio. "What happened?" "Officer Ramirez," Hayes barked, snapping his fingers to demand attention. "This man is a terminated employee. He bypassed security protocols, entered a restricted zone, and attempted to trigger a false emergency evacuation. Arrest him." Ramirez looked at Hayes, then down at Arthur. A terrible, silent conflict tore across the guard's face. He knew Arthur. He knew the old man wouldn't swat a fly, let alone attack a control room. But Hayes was the regional director, and Hayes signed the paychecks. "Artie," Ramirez said softly, taking a slow step forward. "Come on, man. Let's just get you downstairs to the locker room." "He doesn't go downstairs," Hayes interrupted. His voice turned ice cold. "He goes out the front door, into the storm, and he does not come back." Arthur finally found his breath. He gripped the edge of the server rack and pulled himself up. His left leg trembled, barely holding his weight. He didn't look at Ramirez. He didn't want to make the guard's terrible choice any harder than it already was. "Dr. Hayes," Arthur said, his voice ragged but perfectly steady. "I have worked for this facility for 30 years. You cannot throw me out into a Category 5 hurricane without my coat and my personal gear." Hayes walked up to Arthur, stopping mere inches away. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "You haven't worked here for 30 years, Artie," Hayes whispered. "Because, as of this exact moment, I am officially filing a Level 1 sabotage report against you." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Do you know what a Level 1 report means for a federal contractor?" Hayes asked, clearly enjoying every single syllable. "It means your employment contract is nullified with extreme prejudice. It means your severance package is canceled." Hayes leaned in closer. His breath smelled like expensive espresso. "And it means your entire 30-year corporate pension is permanently frozen." Sarah gasped loudly from her desk. She covered her face with her hands. It was a death sentence. Freezing the pension of a 62-year-old man with a bad heart and no savings. It wasn't just firing him. It was erasing his entire life's work. It was institutional murder. "You are leaving this building with exactly what is in your pockets," Hayes said. "Get him out of my sight." Ramirez swallowed hard. He looked away, unable to meet Arthur's eyes. He placed a heavy, trembling hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let's go, Artie," Ramirez mumbled, staring at the white tiles. Arthur didn't fight. He didn't scream. He didn't beg for his pension. He just looked at Hayes one last time, a long, piercing look that stripped away the expensive suit and the gold watch, leaving nothing but a terrified, arrogant little boy pretending to be a god. Then Arthur turned and limped toward the glass doors. He left his heavy steel wrench hidden in the shadows under the director's desk. Ramirez escorted him down the long, pristine hallway, past the executive offices, down the silent, glowing elevator to the main lobby. The massive steel security doors of the main entrance loomed ahead. Outside, the Category 5 hurricane was raging. The wind howled like a wounded animal against the reinforced ballistic glass. The rain was a solid wall of black water. Ramirez swiped his access card. The heavy magnetic bolts clicked open. "I'm sorry, Artie," Ramirez whispered. It was a pathetic, empty apology. Arthur didn't answer. He stepped out into the freezing, violent, pitch-black night. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him. The lock engaged with a heavy final thud. He was locked out, stripped of his dignity, stripped of his life savings, left to freeze in the dark. And somewhere deep beneath his feet, the heavy cast-iron bolts on valve number 4 began to snap. The heavy steel security doors slammed shut behind him. The magnetic lock engaged with a deafening, final thud. Arthur Vance was locked out in the cold. The Category 5 hurricane did not care that he was 62 years old. It did not care about his 30 years of loyal service. It hit him like a physical wall of freezing water and pure kinetic energy. The wind howled at 160 miles per hour. It ripped the heat straight from his bones. Within 5 seconds, his thin orange maintenance coveralls were plastered to his skin, completely soaked through with ice-cold rainwater. He lowered his head and began to walk. The employee parking lot was a massive expanse of black asphalt, currently covered in 3 inches of rushing water. His ancient, rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck was parked at the very edge of the lot. It looked miles away. Every single step was an agonizing, punishing negotiation with his own failing body. The brutal shove in the control room had torn something deep in his left knee. He had to drag his injured leg. The silver duct tape on his broken boot peeled away completely, exposing his wet sock to the freezing concrete. It took him 6 agonizing minutes to cross the parking lot. When he finally reached his truck, his thick, calloused hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his keys. He fumbled with the metal ring. The keys slipped from his numb fingers and splashed into a deep puddle of muddy water. Arthur fell to his knees in the freezing rain. He dug his bare hands into the icy water, desperately searching the rough asphalt until his fingers brushed against the metal. He unlocked the heavy driver's side door, pulled his aching body up into the cab, and slammed the door shut against the screaming wind. The sudden silence inside the truck was heavy, suffocating. Arthur sat perfectly still behind the steering wheel. He did not put the key in the ignition. He did not turn on the engine to get warm. He just sat in the absolute dark, freezing water dripping from his nose and chin, soaking into the torn fabric of the driver's seat. He stared out through the rain-streaked windshield. In the distance, towering over the valley like a silent, unbreakable mountain, was the curved concrete face of Titan Creek Dam, the monument he had helped design, the wall that protected 300,000 sleeping families in the valley below. A crushing, suffocating darkness settled over his chest. Not the darkness of the storm, the darkness of absolute defeat. Dr. Marcus Hayes had not just fired him. Hayes had erased him. His corporate pension was frozen. A Level 1 sabotage report was a permanent, unforgiving black mark on his federal record. It meant he would never see a single penny of the retirement money he had bled for over 3 decades. Arthur's mind drifted away from the massive concrete dam. It drifted to a small, orange plastic pill bottle sitting on his bathroom counter in his tiny apartment. Blood pressure medication. Without his corporate health insurance, a 1-month supply of those little white pills cost $280 out of pocket. He had exactly $42 left in his checking account. His rent was due on Tuesday. Hayes had signed his death warrant. A single tear mixed with the freezing rain on Arthur's cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, bitter failure. He had failed himself. He had failed his life's work. The heavy cast iron bolts on valve number 4 were warping. He knew it. He heard it. And he was sitting in a freezing truck, completely powerless to stop the disaster. The lowest point, the absolute bottom. He closed his eyes. He waited for the freezing cold to finally numb the pain in his knee. Then, a sharp, desperate sound broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. Arthur jumped. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned his head toward the passenger side window. A figure was standing outside in the freezing rain, illuminated only by a flickering amber street lamp. It was Sarah, the 22-year-old junior engineer. She was not wearing a raincoat. She was in her thin, white professional office shirt and dark slacks, completely drenched. She was shivering so violently that Arthur could see her shoulders shaking through the wet glass. She banged her small fist against the window again. Arthur leaned across the bench seat and shoved the heavy manual window crank. The glass rolled down 2 inches. The roaring wind instantly screamed into the cabin. "What are you doing out here, kid?" Arthur yelled over the deafening roar of the storm. "If Hayes catches you, he will destroy your career too." Sarah did not answer his question. Her lips were turning a dangerous shade of pale blue. She reached inside her soaked white shirt. She had been protecting something from the driving rain with her own body heat. She pulled out a crumpled, slightly damp piece of paper. It was not a sleek digital tablet. It was not a glowing blue screen. It was a physical analog printout from a dot matrix printer. She shoved the paper aggressively through the 2-inch gap in the window. Arthur grabbed it. He reached up and switched on the dim yellow overhead dome light of his truck. "I waited until Hayes went into his glass office to call the regional board." Sarah yelled over the wind, wiping the freezing rain from her eyes. "I bypassed the artificial intelligence matrix. I pulled the raw, unfiltered telemetry data directly from the physical sensors on the lower deck." Arthur unfolded the paper. He looked down at the black ink. His breath caught in his throat. The exhaustion and the freezing cold vanished from his body, replaced instantly by a massive surge of pure, terrifying adrenaline. The digital screens upstairs were lying. The $50 million machine was designed to ignore anomalies it considered mathematically impossible. When the hydraulic pressure spiked past the maximum programmed threshold, the software simply decided the physical sensors were broken. It was feeding Hayes a fake, perfect blue baseline to prevent a false panic. But the analog paper told the brutal truth. "The internal pressure is at 10,000 pounds per square inch," Arthur whispered, reading the raw numbers. "The cast iron is actively yielding." "Look at the fracture timeline at the bottom," Sarah cried, her voice cracking with pure terror. Arthur's calloused finger traced the ink down the page. "How long?" Arthur asked. His voice was no longer that of a tired, broken janitor. It was hard, sharp. It was the voice of a chief engineer. 20 minutes, Sarah sobbed. Maybe less. Before the casing completely snaps. When it goes, the sudden pressure differential will rip the entire lower retaining wall apart. The dam will breach. 20 minutes. That was the remaining lifespan of 300,000 people sleeping in their beds. Arthur looked at the massive, dark silhouette of the dam against the violent night sky. He looked down at his empty hands. His heavy steel wrench, his only tool, was still lying under the director's desk in the control room. "Do you have a Level 1 emergency override code?" Arthur asked, looking directly into Sarah's terrified eyes. "Yes," Sarah said, nodding frantically. "I pulled the Department of Energy master cipher from the physical safe when Hayes wasn't looking. But we cannot use it." She pointed a shaking finger toward the main entrance of the facility in the distance. "Hayes declared a full security lockdown the second they threw you out," Sarah pleaded. "The main steel doors are magnetically sealed from the inside. My badge will not open them. Nobody can get back into the building." Arthur turned off the dome light. The truck went dark again. He had 20 minutes before the valley drowned. He had the raw data to prove the disaster. He had a brave junior engineer willing to risk her life to help him. But he was locked out in a freezing hurricane. He had a bad knee, an empty pocket, and no access badge. How do you stop a catastrophic structural failure in less than 20 minutes? And how do you break into a fortified federal building when your only key card is floating in a puddle of muddy water? The machine had walled itself off. "We do not need the main doors," Arthur said. His voice was completely steady. He reached down and popped the passenger side lock. "Get in the truck, kid," Arthur said, reaching for the ignition. "We are taking the janitor's entrance." Arthur turned the ignition key. The ancient rusted engine of the 1998 Ford pickup truck coughed, sputtered, and violently roared to life. It fought against the deafening scream of the Category 5 hurricane tearing through the valley. He slammed his heavy, mud-soaked boot onto the gas pedal. He did not steer the vehicle toward the heavily fortified, brightly illuminated main entrance of the federal building. Those massive steel doors were magnetically sealed from the inside. They only responded to digital security protocols, and Arthur's access had been permanently erased. Instead, he threw the steering wheel hard to the left. The truck lurched forward, bouncing violently as it left the paved asphalt. "Where are we going?" Sarah shouted. She gripped the dashboard with both hands, her knuckles turning completely white. "The main level is a fortress," Arthur yelled back over the howling wind. "But water does not respect a fortress. It always needs a place to drain." He drove the rattling truck down a steep, treacherous access ravine, carved into the muddy cliffside. The tires spun and slipped wildly in the thick sludge. The windshield wipers beat frantically, but they were entirely useless against the absolute deluge of freezing rain. Arthur slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded sideways, coming to a violent, jerking halt at the very bottom of the concrete gorge, just a few feet away from the raging river. "This dam was built in 1986, Arthur shouted, throwing his door open to the storm. Long before the digital upgrades and the biometric scanners. They sealed the old ventilation shafts with concrete 10 years ago, but they missed the secondary storm drain. The machine does not monitor it, because the machine does not know it exists." He limped through the knee-deep mud to the back of his truck. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar. Sarah followed him out into the freezing storm. Her thin, white office shirt was instantly soaked, clinging to her shivering arms. She kept her right hand pressed flat against her chest, desperately guarding the crumpled paper printout from the torrential rain. Hidden behind a thick curtain of dead, overgrown brush was a massive circular concrete pipe. A heavy, rusted iron grate covered the opening. Arthur wedged the iron bar between the rusted vertical grates. He planted his good foot deep in the freezing mud. He ignored the screaming, fiery pain in his arthritic left knee, and he pulled backward with every single ounce of strength he had left in his body. The rusted bolts groaned. The rough iron tore the skin on Arthur's palms, sending warm blood mixing into the freezing rain. His muscles trembled wildly. He gasped for air. "Let me help!" Sarah screamed. She dropped her hands onto the cold iron bar right next to his. "Pull!" With a harsh, violent screech, the iron grate snapped off its decayed hinges. It splashed heavily into the mud. "Get in," Arthur ordered. Sarah dropped to her hands and knees and crawled into the dark, terrifying concrete pipe. Arthur followed immediately behind her. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. The pipe was barely 4 feet in diameter. It was flooded with 2 feet of freezing, stagnant runoff water mixed with decades of toxic machine grease, dead animals and rotting vegetation. It smelled of raw sewage and absolute decay. They could not walk. They had to crawl on all fours. "Keep moving," Arthur gasped. His voice echoed in the tight, suffocating tunnel. Every single time, Arthur dragged his left leg forward. His bad knee scraped violently against the sharp, broken concrete floor. A fresh wave of agonizing, blinding pain shot directly up his spine. His vision blurred into a hazy white. The freezing water numbed his skin, but the fire inside his joints only burned hotter. For a terrifying second, his arms simply gave out. He collapsed face first into the freezing, filthy water. 15 minutes left. "Artie!" Sarah cried out. She turned around in the pitch-black darkness. She grabbed the collar of his heavy orange coveralls and pulled his head up above the sludge. "Do not stop! You cannot stop!" Arthur spit out the toxic black water. He forced his eyes open. He looked at the young, terrified junior engineer. She was freezing to death, covered in toxic mud, but she refused to give up. He nodded slowly. He dug his bleeding hands back into the concrete floor and forced his broken body to keep crawling. While Arthur and Sarah fought for every single agonizing inch in the pitch-black darkness. 300 feet above them, the absolute illusion of perfection was finally shattering. Inside the central control room, Dr. Marcus Hayes poured himself a fresh, steaming cup of espresso. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored charcoal suit. He looked at the 20 junior engineers sitting in total, terrified silence at their terminals. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Hayes announced. His voice was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with condescension. "We do not listen to panic. We listen to the algorithm. The screens are blue. The physical structure is absolutely secure." He pointed to the massive digital wall covering the front of the room. And at that exact, precise second, the screens flickered. It was not a small digital glitch. The massive visual display violently stuttered. The perfect, beautiful blue graph representing the lower hydraulic pressure vanished completely. It was instantly replaced by a chaotic, cascading stream of corrupted green code. Hayes froze. His hand stopped halfway to his mouth. The $50 million artificial intelligence matrix had reached a hard, undeniable physical limit. Deep in the basement, the concrete housing around Valve 4 finally buckled under 10,000 pounds of pressure. The physical movement was so violent that it sheared the main fiber optic data cables clean in half. The machine didn't just register an error. It lost its eyes completely. Pop. The massive wall of digital screens went completely, terrifyingly black. The pristine control room plunged into absolute darkness. Nobody breathed. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was only the sound of the hurricane pounding relentlessly against the reinforced glass. Then the emergency backup klaxons triggered. A deafening mechanical siren wailed through the room. It was a sound designed to rattle the human nervous system. Blood-red strobe lights began to flash frantically from the ceiling, bathing the white tiles in a violent, chaotic crimson glow. But the worst part was not the blinding lights or the screaming sirens. It was the floor. The entire control room violently lurched. It was a deep, structural heave. Desks shifted across the room. Heavy office chairs rolled backward and slammed into the glass walls. Hayes dropped his espresso cup. The delicate porcelain shattered on the floor, splashing hot coffee over his expensive leather shoes. "Sir!" A senior supervisor screamed over the blaring sirens. He stared down at his analog backup gauge. The physical telemetry just re-engaged. The main pressure spiked past 10,000 pounds. The lower retaining wall is actively fracturing. Hayes backed away from the dead screens. His chest heaved. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a very expensive suit. His perfect algorithm was dead. The uneducated janitor was right, and it was far too late. The automatic valves are severed. The supervisor panicked, frantically typing on a dead keyboard. We have to manually bleed the pressure from this room. Dr. Hayes, what are your orders? Hayes didn't answer. He looked at the red flashing lights. He felt the terrifying deep vibration in his feet. The dam was crying. He lunged for his security radio on his desk. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it once before frantically pressing the transmit button. Aviation Command. This is the regional director! Hayes screamed into the radio. His voice was completely stripped of its polite, educated authority. It was just raw, pathetic, animal terror. I need the executive transport helicopter on the roof helipad right now. Immediate evacuation. The 20 engineers in the room stopped typing. They slowly turned and looked at him in the flashing red light. Dr. Hayes, Sarah's desk mate whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. What about us? Hayes didn't look at them. He didn't care about their lives. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase from his desk. The manual valves are jammed, Hayes yelled, backing toward the rear exit. The structural integrity is compromised. The dam is dead. Get out of my way. He turned around, ready to abandon 20 of his own people to drown in a concrete tomb. He took a frantic step toward the magnetically sealed glass doors of the executive elevator. But before he could reach the heavy metal handle, a loud mechanical clack echoed over the screaming sirens. Someone was overriding the physical lock from the outside. Hayes stepped back, completely confused. The heavy glass doors violently swung open. Standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit, was Arthur Vance. His orange coveralls were completely soaked in toxic black mud, machine grease, and rainwater. His bare hands were bleeding freely. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. Sarah stood right behind him, holding the rusted iron pry bar they had used to break through the secondary fire doors. They looked like soldiers returning from a brutal war zone. Arthur stepped into the pristine, red-lit control room. He did not look at the 20 shocked engineers. He looked dead into the terrified eyes of Dr. Marcus Hayes. And Arthur locked the door behind him. The heavy magnetic locks on the glass doors engaged with a loud, absolute click. Arthur Vance had just sealed the central control room from the inside. Nobody was leaving. Not the terrified junior engineers. And certainly not Dr. Marcus Hayes. The deafening scream of the emergency sirens continued to wail. Blood-red strobe lights flashed violently across the white tiles. The floor beneath them shuddered with another deep, agonizing groan from the failing concrete 300 feet below. But inside the room, time seemed to completely stop. 20 highly educated engineers stared in absolute, stunned silence at the 62-year-old janitor. He was covered from head to toe in thick, black, toxic sludge. Blood dripped slowly from his torn palms, mixing with the rainwater pooling around his broken boots. He looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. Hayes stood frozen near the elevator, clutching his expensive leather briefcase tightly against his chest. His flawless charcoal suit was stained with spilled coffee. His face was entirely pale. "How did you get back in here?" Hayes whispered. His voice was no longer arrogant. It was thin, desperate. The biometric scanners, the magnetic seals. Arthur did not answer him. He didn't even look at him. He walked forward. His left leg dragged slightly, a physical reminder of the brutal shove he had taken less than an hour ago. Every step left a thick, black, oily footprint on the pristine white tiles. He moved with absolute terrifying purpose. He bypassed the $50 million artificial intelligence terminal. He walked right past the massive, dead digital screens that had lied to them all. He ignored the frantic, blinking error codes on Sarah's desk. He walked straight toward the far right corner of the room. Mounted on the concrete wall, completely ignored and partially covered in a thin layer of dust, was a heavy, square steel panel. It looked like an old bank vault door. It had no digital screens, no touchscreen interfaces, just a thick iron handle and a heavy mechanical 12-digit keypad. It was the manual override console, the physical, analog connection to the secondary spillway valves. It had not been opened in 2 decades. Arthur stopped in front of it. He reached out with a bleeding hand and wiped the dust off the mechanical keypad. Hayes finally snapped out of his terrified trance. He realized what the old man was about to do, and his arrogance, deeply ingrained in his bones, flared up one final time. "Get away from that wall!" Hayes screamed over the blaring sirens. He dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Arthur. "Have you completely lost your mind? That is a sealed federal failsafe." Arthur did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the cold steel panel. "The pressure on valve 4 is past 10,000 pounds, Arthur said. His voice was perfectly calm, cutting through the chaotic noise of the room like a sharp knife. "If I do not bleed the secondary spillways manually, the concrete will fracture in less than 6 minutes. "You can't!" Hayes yelled, taking a frantic, desperate step forward. He looked around the room, demanding support from his terrified staff. "Tell him. Tell this uneducated fool that he cannot open that panel." The senior supervisor, the man who had been frantically typing just minutes before, looked at Hayes. Then he looked at Arthur. "He is right, Artie," the supervisor said, his voice shaking with absolute panic. "We are locked out. That panel is mechanically sealed by the Department of Energy. It requires a Level 1 federal cipher to engage the unlocking mechanism." Sarah stepped out from the shadows near the glass doors. She was still shivering, covered in mud, clutching the iron pry bar. "I have the cipher," Sarah said loudly, her voice trembling but determined. She reached into her pocket to pull out the stolen document. "I pulled it from the safe. I can read it to him." Hayes spun around, his eyes widening in pure shock. He looked at Sarah like she had just grown a second head. "You?" Hayes spat. "You committed federal treason? I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary. Give me that code right now." He lunged toward her. But Arthur's voice stopped him dead in his tracks. "Keep the paper in your pocket, Sarah," Arthur said. Hayes froze. He slowly turned his head back toward the steel panel. Arthur had not turned around. He raised his right hand, the hand that was bleeding from tearing off the iron storm grate. The hand that had scrubbed floors and changed light bulbs for 30 years. He hovered his calloused, dirty fingers over the heavy mechanical keypad. "You don't need the paper?" Hayes sneered, letting out a harsh, desperate laugh. The fear in his chest was turning into manic disbelief. "What are you going to do, old man? Guess? There are 479 million possible combinations. If you enter it wrong once, the internal mechanism permanently locks." The 20 engineers in the room held their collective breath. The floor violently shuddered again, a terrifying reminder that their time was rapidly expiring. "You are a janitor," Hayes whispered, the panic finally bleeding completely through his voice. "Step away from the panel." Arthur didn't guess. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look down at his hands. His fingers moved across the mechanical keypad with blinding, terrifying precision. It was pure muscle memory. The kind of memory that is burned deeply into the nervous system over decades. Beep, 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 beep. 4 numbers. Hayes's eyes narrowed. Beep, beep, beep. 8 numbers. The senior supervisor leaned forward over his desk, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The old man wasn't just pressing buttons. He was typing a complex encrypted sequence without a single second of hesitation. Beep, 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 beep. 12 numbers. Arthur pressed the heavy iron enter key. For one agonizing, terrifying second, the room fell completely silent. Even the sirens seemed to fade into the background. Deep inside the thick concrete wall, a heavy mechanical gear slowly turned. Clunk. A bright, solid green light illuminated on the heavy steel panel. The hermetic seal hissed, releasing 20 years of pressurized air. The heavy vault door clicked loudly, unlocking itself from the federal fail-safe. 20 highly educated junior engineers collectively gasped. Someone whispered out loud, asking if this was real. Hayes stumbled backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the spilled coffee. He hit the edge of a server rack and barely caught himself. His legs suddenly looked incredibly weak. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He stared at the glowing green light like he was looking at a ghost. "How?" Hayes choked out. His vocal cords felt like sandpaper. He couldn't breathe. "How do you know the Department of Energy master cipher?" Arthur reached out and grabbed the heavy iron handle. He pulled the steel door wide open, revealing the massive physical override lever hidden inside. But he didn't pull the lever. Not yet. Arthur slowly turned around. He finally looked directly at Dr. Marcus Hayes. He didn't look at him with anger. He looked at him with the absolute, terrifying calmness of a man who had already won. "I need my tool, Dr. Hayes," Arthur said quietly. He turned his back on the open panel. He began to walk slowly, methodically, toward the director's pristine, expensive, mahogany desk at the front of the room. He was going to retrieve the heavy steel wrench that Hayes had kicked away. And he was going to show the arrogant director exactly who he had thrown out into the storm. The heavy magnetic locks of the glass doors remained completely sealed. The deafening emergency sirens continued to scream, and the blood-red strobe lights flashed violently, painting the exhausted faces of the 20 junior engineers in a chaotic, rhythmic crimson. The concrete floor beneath their feet trembled with another deep, agonizing groan. There were barely 3 minutes left before the structural integrity of Titan Creek Dam suffered a catastrophic, irreversible breach. But Arthur Vance did not rush. He stood in front of the open steel override panel. The massive mechanical lever was fully exposed in the dark cavity, waiting to be pulled. But Arthur did not reach for it. Not yet. He slowly turned his back on the glowing green light of the federal fail-safe. He began to walk across the pristine white tiles, heading directly toward the center of the room. His scuffed, broken boots squelched against the floor, leaving a thick, dark trail of toxic black mud. He moved with the terrifying, absolute calmness of a man walking through his own living room. He ignored the blare of the sirens. He ignored the terrified stares of the engineering staff. He walked straight toward the massive, expensive mahogany desk belonging to the regional director. Dr. Marcus Hayes was backed up against the edge of a server rack. His custom-tailored charcoal suit was heavily stained with spilled espresso. He watched the old man approaching his desk with eyes that were wide and completely filled with a frantic, animalistic confusion. Arthur reached the desk. He didn't look at Hayes. He slowly lowered his body, gritting his teeth as a sharp spike of fiery pain shot through his degenerating left knee. He reached his rough, bleeding hand into the dark shadows beneath the mahogany desk. His calloused fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. He pulled the industrial wrench out from the darkness and into the flashing red light. It was the exact same heavy tool that Hayes had violently kicked away in a fit of arrogant rage just an hour ago. The tool that Hayes had mocked as a primitive piece of garbage. But the wrench looked entirely different now. When Arthur had desperately used the heavy steel handle as a pry bar to tear the rusted iron storm grate off the secondary drain tunnel in the freezing mud, the immense physical friction had taken a severe toll. The thick layers of dirty black electrical tape that had hidden the lower half of the handle for 20 years were gone. The old, rotting adhesive had completely shredded, stripped away by the sheer force of Arthur's desperate struggle in the storm. Now the naked, highly polished industrial steel was fully exposed to the world. Arthur stood up straight. He held the massive wrench in his right hand. He didn't point it at Hayes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, Arthur stepped directly in front of Dr. Marcus Hayes. He raised his hand and placed the heavy steel wrench, gently, deliberately, onto the center of the pristine mahogany desk. Clank. The heavy solid metal hit the expensive wood with a loud, absolute finality that seemed to slice right through the wail of the sirens. "Look at it," Arthur whispered softly. Hayes was shaking. His manicured hands trembled violently at his sides. He couldn't stop them. His arrogant brain told him to look away, but the gravitational pull of the moment was absolute. He slowly lowered his eyes to the desk. The blood-red strobe lights of the emergency klaxons reflected perfectly off the polished steel handle. And right there, carved deeply into the cold metal, with perfect, permanent precision, catching the red light with every rhythmic flash, were 3 lines of text. Chief Engineer Arthur Vance. Head of Structural Design, Titan Creek Dam. 1986. Hayes stared at the engraving. He read the words once. He read them again. His highly educated brain frantically tried to process the impossible, world-shattering information. The man he had screamed at. The man he had physically shoved to the floor. The man he had stripped of a 30-year pension and ordered thrown out into a Category 5 hurricane to freeze to death. Was not a janitor. He was the master architect. He was the man who calculated the exact curvature of the 3-million-gallon retaining wall. The man who poured the foundation. The man who quite literally built the very floor Hayes was currently failing to stand on. Arthur Vance didn't just know the top-secret federal cipher code. He was the man who programmed it into the wall 30 years ago. The physical collapse of Dr. Marcus Hayes was immediate, brutal, and absolute. His arrogant, condescending smirk was completely erased from his skull. His jaw literally dropped open, hanging slack in a silent gasp of sheer, devastating horror. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His knees instantly buckled. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany desk with both of his trembling hands, just to keep himself from completely collapsing onto the white tiles. His perfectly polished black leather shoes scrambled uselessly against the floor. He looked at the engraving, then slowly lifted his heavy head to look at the man in the dirty orange coveralls. "You," Hayes choked out. A pathetic, ragged wheeze scraped its way out of his throat. He couldn't form a complete sentence. The air simply refused to fill his lungs. "You, the architect, but you mop the floors." The $50 million artificial intelligence system was dead. His Ivy League education was useless, and the man he had treated like absolute garbage was the only god left in the room. Sarah, standing near the shattered glass doors covered in toxic black mud, covered her mouth with her bleeding hands, tears of pure relief and disbelief streaming down her face. The entire room of 20 junior engineers stared at Arthur in complete, stunned awe. They finally understood. Arthur did not smile. He did not gloat. "You built a $50 million machine to monitor the health of my dam, Dr. Hayes," Arthur said, his voice carrying the quiet, undeniable weight of a mountain. "But you forgot to look at the concrete." Arthur reached out and picked up the heavy steel wrench. He turned his back on the broken, stammering director. He walked away from the desk, leaving Hayes clinging pathetically to the mahogany wood, drowning in his own devastating humiliation. Arthur limped quickly back across the room to the open steel vault on the wall. The floor gave another massive, terrifying shudder. A violent crack echoed up from the basement. The retaining wall was seconds away from completely fracturing. He stepped up to the panel. The manual override lever was a massive piece of solid cast iron. Arthur slotted the beautifully machined head of his heavy steel wrench perfectly over the thick locking nut of the lever. It fit with an absolute flawless precision. He had designed that nut to match this exact wrench 30 years ago. He wrapped both of his bleeding, calloused hands around the handle. He planted his good boot firmly on the trembling floor. He closed his eyes, fighting through the agonizing pain shooting up his leg. He looked over his shoulder. He looked past the 20 stunned junior engineers. He looked right into the terrified, defeated eyes of Dr. Marcus Hayes. "Water does not read computer screens, Doctor," Arthur said, his deep voice carrying clearly over the blaring alarms. He threw his entire body weight backward, pulling the heavy steel wrench downward with every single ounce of strength he had left in his 62-year-old body. It reads steel. Ka-thunk. The heavy locking nut shrieked. Decades of rust cracked and shattered. The massive mechanical lever slammed all the way down to the bottom of the track, locking firmly into the override position. For 2 terrifying, agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The silence in the control room was deafening. Then, a sound began to build deep within the earth. It started as a low, rumbling vibration. It grew fiercely louder, vibrating violently up through the soles of their boots. It sounded like a massive freight train, roaring directly beneath their feet. 300 feet below, the massive cast iron secondary spillway gates, sealed shut for 20 years, violently slammed open. 3 million gallons of highly pressurized, freezing river water instantly blasted out of the emergency release tunnels. It shot hundreds of feet out into the empty canyon below in a spectacular roaring fountain of pure kinetic energy. Inside the control room, the terrifying, high-pitched scream of the groaning metal completely stopped. The violent, sickening vibration in the floor instantly smoothed out. The pressure gauge on Sarah's analog terminal suddenly reversed. The needle plummeted from the catastrophic red zone, spinning wildly backwards, and settled safely, securely, into the deep green. The red strobe lights on the ceiling stopped flashing. The blaring emergency sirens slowly wound down, fading into a quiet, mechanical hum. The pristine white fluorescent lights flickered once, then hummed back to life. The room returned to a blinding, quiet white. The dam stopped shaking. The concrete was holding. Arthur Vance let go of the heavy steel wrench. He leaned his forehead against the cold steel of the vault door and closed his eyes. His chest heaved with exhaustion. He had saved them all. The catastrophic breach was averted. But as the control room filled with the sounds of junior engineers, weeping in pure relief and hugging each other, Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Dr. Marcus Hayes. Hayes was still slumped against his desk, staring blankly at the floor. The storm outside was beginning to pass, but for the arrogant director, the true nightmare was just about to begin. The storm broke just after sunrise. The violent, 160-mile-per-hour winds that had battered the Blackwood Valley all night finally faded into a heavy, quiet mist. Sunlight began to pierce through the thick gray clouds, reflecting off the 3 million gallons of water that was now draining safely, steadily through the open spillways of Titan Creek Dam. The concrete had held. The valley was safe. But inside the pristine, perfectly lit central control room, Dr. Marcus Hayes was completely broken. He had not moved from his mahogany desk. He remained slumped against the heavy wood, staring blankly down at his $18,000 gold watch. The seconds ticked by, loud and mocking in the quiet room. His custom-tailored charcoal suit was ruined. His reputation was shattered. But Hayes was a survivor of corporate politics. His arrogant brain was rapidly calculating how to spin the catastrophe. He would blame the artificial intelligence software developers. He would blame the severe weather patterns. He would claim that he, the regional director, had personally authorized the manual override. He actually believed his Ivy League degree and his political connections would shield him from the consequences. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the control room buzzed. Hayes slowly lifted his head. His eyes widened slightly. A small, pathetic flicker of hope ignited in his chest. The federal evacuation helicopter he had frantically demanded hours ago must have finally arrived. The corporate board of directors had sent a transport to pull him out of this nightmare. He pushed himself up off the desk, desperately trying to straighten his ruined silk tie. He didn't get an evacuation team. He got federal agents. 4 broad-shouldered men wearing dark, tactical windbreakers marched purposefully into the control room. Printed across their backs in bright, unforgiving yellow block letters was a single acronym: FBI. They were flanked by 2 armed United States federal marshals. They didn't ask the junior engineers for directions. They didn't stop at the reception terminal. They walked with absolute, terrifying authority straight toward Dr. Marcus Hayes. Dr. Marcus Hayes, the lead agent said. His voice was hard, flat, and completely devoid of respect. Step away from the console and place your hands behind your back. Hayes froze. The pathetic flicker of hope in his chest was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, suffocating wave of pure terror. "What?" Hayes stammered, holding his hands up defensively. He looked around the room, desperately seeking an ally. "Wait, you do not understand. There was a software anomaly. The artificial intelligence, it filtered the data improperly. It was a machine error. I followed standard protocol." The agent did not stop walking. He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "We have physical logs submitted by junior engineer Sarah Jenkins at 2:15 this morning," the agent stated, stopping inches from Hayes. "Those logs confirm that you willfully ignored catastrophic mechanical warnings, to maintain the illusion of a functioning AI system. You attempted to abandon a fortified federal structure during a Category 5 emergency. Turn around, now. I am the regional director, Hayes screamed. His voice cracked, rising to a desperate, shrill pitch. You cannot do this. Do you know who I am? The agent grabbed Hayes by the shoulder, spun him around with a brutal, practiced efficiency, and slammed him chest first onto his own expensive mahogany desk. Click, click. The heavy steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his perfectly manicured wrists. The sound echoed loudly across the silent room. 20 junior engineers watched. Nobody looked away. Nobody felt sorry for him. They watched the arrogant bully who had terrorized them, the man who had tried to leave them to drown in the dark, being restrained like a common criminal. As the agents marched Hayes toward the door, he looked over his shoulder. Arthur Vance was sitting quietly on a metal folding chair near the open vault door. He was wrapped in a thick thermal blanket provided by the paramedics. His face was bruised, and a medic was carefully bandaging his bleeding, torn hands. Hayes stared at the old man, the man he had kicked, the man he had thrown into the freezing storm. Arthur didn't say a single word. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just looked at Hayes with eyes that were ancient, calm, and filled with profound pity. The glass doors hissed shut. Hayes was gone. And that was only the very beginning of his absolute destruction. When you build an entire career on a foundation of arrogance and lies, the collapse does not happen slowly. It cascades. One falling domino triggers a catastrophic avalanche. Dr. Marcus Hayes was officially terminated by the Titan Creek Energy Corporation before the federal transport vehicle even reached the FBI field office in Baltimore. The termination was completely public, citing gross criminal negligence. By noon the following day, the Federal Board of Engineering held an emergency session. They did not just suspend his credentials, they permanently and irrevocably revoked his engineering license. Marcus Hayes would never legally be allowed to touch a blueprint or step foot in a control room for the rest of his natural life. But the hardest blow came exactly 48 hours later. The $50 million artificial intelligence matrix that Hayes had staked his entire reputation on was owned by his private tech firm, Apex Dynamics. When the investigative report leaked to the press, detailing exactly how the AI had actively masked a catastrophic breach by overriding manual sensors, the market reacted with extreme, violent prejudice. Apex Dynamics stock plummeted 85% in a single morning. Institutional investors panicked and pulled their funding. Major federal contracts were instantly canceled. By Friday evening, the company filed for Chapter 11 total bankruptcy. The $50 million empire was reduced to absolute ashes. 3 months later, a federal judge struck the final, devastating blow. Marcus Hayes stood in a quiet courtroom. He was no longer wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He was wearing an oversized, standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit, a cruel, poetic echo of the uniform he had mocked Arthur for wearing. The judge did not look at him with pity. He looked at him with profound disgust. Hayes was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. He lost his title, his company, his wealth, and his freedom, all because he refused to listen to an old man with a dirty wrench. But for Arthur Vance, the story ended very differently. The board of directors of Titan Creek Energy did not just issue a quiet, private apology to the man who saved their $2 billion investment. They understood exactly what Arthur had done, and they were absolutely terrified of a massive public relations nightmare. They over-delivered on every single metric. The first thing they did was completely restore Arthur's 30-year corporate pension, entirely tax-free. But they didn't stop there. They awarded him a retroactive hazard payout multiplier of 300%, recognizing the extreme physical danger he faced in the storm drain. Arthur Vance, the man who had worried about paying $280 for his blood pressure medication, suddenly found himself with a retirement account pushing $3.5 million. But Arthur had two specific conditions before he would sign their non-disclosure agreement. First, the regional human resources director, the man who had blindly followed Hayes's order to process Arthur's termination and freeze his pension without conducting a basic investigation, was fired immediately. He was clearing out his desk before Arthur even left the corporate building. Arthur could have walked away. He could have bought a beautiful house on a quiet beach, fixed his bad knee, and never looked at another piece of concrete for the rest of his life. But Arthur Vance was a builder. He always had been. "I do not want to retire," Arthur told the silent room of powerful executives. "And I do not want a plaque on a wall. I want a systemic change. I want you to stop training young minds to trust a screen more than they trust their own eyes." With the full backing of the federal government and his own substantial funds, he established a brand new educational division, the Vance Engineering Initiative. It was a rigorous, fully funded academic fellowship designed specifically for top-tier engineering graduates. Before they were ever allowed to touch digital modeling software, they were required to spend 6 months in the field. They had to learn how to mix concrete. They had to learn how to read the physical signs of stress on cast iron. They had to learn that water reads steel, not code. And Arthur didn't run the board alone. He appointed a highly capable, exceptionally brave young woman as the vice president of operations for the Vance Initiative, Sarah Jenkins. The 22-year-old junior engineer who had risked her entire career running out into a freezing hurricane with a crumpled piece of analog paper. She received a massive promotion, a corner office, and the absolute respect of every engineer in the building. 6 months later, Titan Creek Dam, Level 4 basement. The dark, damp corridor smelled exactly the same. Wet ozone, heavy machine grease, and damp earth. The massive cast iron casing of valve number 4 sat quietly in the shadows, humming with a low, healthy, rhythmic vibration. A group of people walked slowly down the corridor. At the front of the group was Arthur Vance. He was 63 years old now. He walked with a slight, noticeable limp. He still wore a crisp, clean pair of orange maintenance coveralls. But the name tag pinned to his chest didn't say Artie. It didn't hang from a frayed piece of string. It was a heavy engraved brass plate that read, Chief Inspector of Physical Integrity. And trailing right behind him, hanging onto his every single word, were 5 brilliant young engineering students from MIT and Stanford. They wore pristine, white, hard hats, but they weren't looking at expensive digital tablets. They were holding cheap spiral notebooks and clicking pens. Arthur stopped in front of the massive cast iron valve. He reached into his deep side pocket. He pulled out the heavy industrial steel wrench. The black electrical tape was permanently gone. The polished steel gleamed under the dim fluorescent lights, proudly displaying his name and his legacy deeply engraved into the metal. He turned around to face the 5 young students. They stopped immediately. They stood in absolute respectful silence. Nobody laughed at his orange coveralls. Nobody looked down at his scuffed leather boots. Arthur reached out and placed his bare, calloused hand flat against the cold, unyielding metal pipe. "Close your laptops," Arthur instructed softly. His deep, gravelly voice echoed warmly down the concrete hallway. The 5 students instantly folded their devices and tucked them under their arms. "The screens upstairs will tell you the numbers," Arthur said, pacing slowly behind them. "Numbers are important. But the numbers can be manipulated. The numbers can break. The metal does not lie. Feel the vibration. Memorize the rhythm. If this rhythm ever changes, you do not check the computer. You check the steel." The world constantly tries to measure a person's worth by the things that are easy to see. We judge people by the cut of their designer suit, the luxury brand of their car, or the fancy academic letters printed after their last name on a glass door. We build massive, complicated social systems that tell us exactly who is important and who is completely invisible. And we believe those systems right up until the exact moment they fail us. Dr. Marcus Hayes believed he was a god because he understood a machine. But he nearly drowned 300,000 innocent people because he refused to understand a man. Arthur Vance had no corner office. He had no $18,000 gold watch. He had a broken pair of scuffed boots, an arthritic knee, and a piece of heavy industrial steel. He was treated like a ghost. He was humiliated and thrown out into the freezing rain. But when the digital screens went black, and the highly educated men panicked in the dark, it was the invisible man with the calloused hands who stepped forward and held the entire world together. True power does not need to scream its credentials. It does not need to bully the weak to prove its strength. True power is quiet. It is patient. It is forged through decades of dirty hands and hard work, waiting for the exact moment when the world finally realizes that the screens are lying. Have you ever known the absolute, undeniable truth, but were forced to sit in silence just because your job title wasn't considered important enough? Have you ever watched an arrogant person completely ignore the plain truth until it was entirely too late? Drop a comment below. I read every single one of them, and I want to hear your story. Tell me about the time you were the smartest person in the room, but nobody bothered to listen. And if you believe that real, hard-earned experience will always matter vastly more than a fancy piece of paper, hit that subscribe button. Because here, the truth always walks in.